Well, for those of you who were here last week, which I think is most of you, Leiden started by looking at the book of Proverbs. So that's one of the books of the Bible that's focused on wisdom and teaching and obtaining it. It's full of different short sayings or proverbs suggesting the wise path to take through life. How to make wise choices when there's not necessarily a moral distinction between two different paths. They're not a simple recipe for success, and in some cases, as Leighton pointed out last week, they can contradict and conflict with each other. But the book is written for the purpose of teaching young men how to grow wise and how to navigate the world. And as you might imagine, the author put what he felt was the most important proverb at the very start of the book. So this is the first one. It starts in verse 7 after the introductory passage describing the whole book's purpose. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, what does that mean? The second half is fairly straightforward. That if you despise wisdom and instruction, you don't want to learn or get taught, then you're foolish. But what does the first half mean? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. What does that mean? Does it mean that the way to get wise is to be cowering in the corner, trying to not get struck by lightning? Obviously not. But this is the phrase that I want to look at today. If you read through your Bible, the whole Bible, you'll see this phrase popping up again and again. I just pointed out one place where it appears in Proverbs, though it appears in other places as well. But it's all through the Old Testament, through the Psalms, through Job, through Deuteronomy. There's these constant descriptions of he feared God, or he did not fear God, or he was someone who feared God. And then even into the New Testament you come and you have these descriptions of Gentiles who are following the God of Israel. They're not described as God-worshipping Gentiles. They're described as God-fearing Gentiles. It would surely make a lot more sense to just call them God-worshipping or God-following. Those terms make a lot more sense. And so this is a confusing term if you simply take it on the face of it. Surely you would, use terms like God-worshipping or God-fearing. But those aren't the terms that are used. The term used is fear. Now, the reason why it's confusing is that there's two types of fear that the Bible is using here, and that I'm going to focus on. And so for those of you who are taking notes, they're two of my major headings. There's a terrified fear. There's a joyful fear. And then the third section is overcoming fear. Now, the first type of fear, what I want to look at, is not this fear of the Lord, but it's what initially comes to mind if we think about what the word fear means, what I've labeled terrified fear. Now, it's how we use it in normal life. For example, just looking at the headlines from the past month, here's a couple. Bosses fear legal minefield. Locals fear thousands more cars. Flood fear in Brisbane. Ombudsman find excessive culture of fear in the public service. Fears arsonists will strike again. This kind of fear, it's a feeling that something bad is going to happen and a strong desire to stop it. It's based on really primal instincts, like fear of a lion because it's going to eat you. This is a good kind of fear. It's good to feel this kind of fear if you're crossing the road and suddenly a car swerves around the corner. You want the fear to get you sprinting out of the way. Whenever you feel this fear, it's because something is threatening you or something that you care about. And it's a drive to stop that thing from happening. For example, to get you away from that car. Though in some cases, it's fear of something that you can't control, like fear of a coming flood, which you can only prepare for, or an arsonist striking again. There's a sliding scale of this kind of fear, obviously. There's fear of a minor inconvenience, like fear of getting stuck in traffic. But then there's also, at the other end of this kind of fear, physically breaking down in terror, unable to do anything else. But the fear is always in a response to a threat to something that is valued, something that is precious, whether that be life, possessions, or simply peace and quiet. And the more precious the thing that is threatened is to you, the greater your fear will be. Fear of increased traffic in an area is a very different kind of fear to a car bearing down on you. Now, on the face of it, this is not the kind of fear that is used in a positive sense throughout the Bible. When Proverbs starts with the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom, it is not talking about that kind of fear, trying to hide from God and his fury. But this is the reaction that Adam had in the garden after eating the fruit. His response to God is, I heard the sound of you in the garden and I was afraid. Adam was afraid of God because of his nakedness and what he'd done. When fear is used in this sense, it's generally towards those who displease God rather than those who please him. For example, Isaiah in many different passages talks of people fleeing to the cave to get away from the fearful presence of the Lord. Now, if you're talking about someone who fears the Lord in this sense, it's someone who is scared of him. And this can be a way that people view God. This can be the way that people relate to God. It's almost a caricature, but you can imagine God as Zeus up in the clouds with lightning bolts, just waiting for you to trip up, eager to judge and then smite you. But while that might be the caricature, in reality, this can be the God that some people see. They can see God as a divine rule giver, waiting for any veering from those laws, however strict, leading to judgment and condemnation. Ruling by fear, by far more than by love. And this can be how many cults and sects form and operate, driving people towards God or towards their leader, not by love, but by fear. Fear of the outside world or fear of God, fear of everything falling apart. Now, fear and terror on the face of it is a rational response to an angry God. But it is not the response that the Bible encourages towards God or that God desires. This is not the kind of fear that Proverbs means when it says it is the beginning of wisdom. This kind of fear is the consequence of failing to feel him in the right way. This terror kind of fear is what John is talking about in 1 John 4 in the midst of a fairly famous section declaring God's love. By this, his love is perfected with us, so that we might have confidence in the day of judgment, because as he is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. Now, there's a lot in that passage, even more in the broader passage. It's very theological dense, but the key point is at the start of verse 18 there. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, for fear has to do with punishment. John is being fairly explicit here. Fearing God in the terrified sense, it only actually makes sense if you have a deficient view of God. When we see God's love for us, when we experience God's love for us, it purges this kind of fear for us. We no longer need to fear judgment. With Jesus, we don't need to fear that kind of judgment. We don't need to be scared of God. It's the wrong kind of fear. The Bible is adamant about the importance of fearing God. It comes up again and again. But John says this fear, this terror of God is driven out by love. If terror of the Lord was what he desired, then those facing judgment and being terrified of it would be what pleased him. But that's not what the beginning of wisdom is. That's not what God desires. What he desires is what brings us to our second meaning of the word fear, which I've dubbed a joyful fear. And this is the sense that is almost always used when talking about fear of the Lord in the Bible. It's heavily through all the wisdom literature. So Proverbs, Psalms have this same passage multiple times. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. At the end of Ecclesiastes, to sum up the whole book, he brings up, this is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. In Job, when God is commanding Job at the start of the book as this amazing man, one of the terms he uses is he fears God. Have you noticed my servant Job? He's the finest man in all the earth. He's blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. And actually, the first accusation that Satan brings against Job is that he fears God only out of self-interest, which wouldn't make sense if you're thinking about being terrified of God, because why would you be terrified and then get stuff? Anyway, doesn't make sense. In the New Testament, you have the Gentile followers of Judaism, again, being referred to as God-fearing Jews. For example, Cornelius, who Peter goes and visits in the book of Acts. But if it doesn't mean terrified fear in the first sense, what does it mean? Fear in this sense involves reverence and awe. To avoid confusion with these two terms of fear, some translations actually do away with the word fear, and they'll use the term reverence instead, or revere. But on its own, it just seems like a small word. This fear, it's not just reverence, it's a mixture of awe and reverence and obedience and love and trembling. Think of a sense of awe. Imagine something that you've seen. Think back to what you've seen that is absolutely grand and awe-inspiring. A great vista from the top of a mountain, or a picture of a galaxy in great detail just showing millions of stars. They make you both feel absolutely small, either by the size or by their magnitude and beauty. Now blend this with reverence. It's a great respect for something, a great man or woman. Now, this is admittedly something that we do terribly in Australia. We tend to lean on things like irreverence and disrespect for authority and sacred things. It is not something that we do at all. But if you think about what might strike this kind of emotion into people, this reverence, it's going to depend person to person on what people value. Imagine if you're an accomplished artist, a great portrait painter, and you have the opportunity to sit with the Mona Lisa with no glass or protection around it. You're handling it. Or you get to handle St. Edward's crown used in the coronation of the English monarch for centuries. Or the US's Declaration of Independence. Or the bat used by Don Bradman when he achieved his highest ever score of 452 not out. Or the guitar used by Elvis. Or Taylor Swift at the concert last night. Like I said, it very much depends on the person. Or visiting a place of great significance, like the Holy Land or something like that. Or even the moment of holding your first child or grandchild for the first time. There's an awe and fear and reverence that you feel in these circumstances. There's an apprehension and excitement around handling something like this. Handling something truly precious and significant, but also fragile. There's a fear in there, but it's not a fear for yourself. It's a fear for the object. There's an awe of the significance, but also a fear in the face of possibly marring it. I wouldn't say that I'm scared of the Mona Lisa. It can't do anything to me. But I would say that I'm scared to handle the Mona Lisa. There is a love tied up with this fear. Seeing this incredible value and not wanting to mar it. Consider the contrast between these two different types of fear. You can feel fear for the same object for very different drivers behind them. To continue with the Mona Lisa example, you can also think about whatever the example would be for yourself that would be significant. Imagine you're given that object to look over and to hold. On one hand, you could be fearful and someone who exhibits great care out of the terror of consequences. Imagine you drop this and you're going to go down forever in history as the one who destroyed that masterpiece, who made that mark. You'd be sued for billions of dollars and it'd wreck my life, I'd go broke. But consider the opposite kind of fear, that awe fear. You'll be fearful of it because of fear of marring an irreplaceable masterpiece, forever marring that thing that you have such admiration for. That's the second kind of fear that's the beginning of wisdom. I'd agree that it's probably, on the face of it, wise to fear God out of terror or judgment. But if that's your kind of fear, it comes from a complete misunderstanding of God's love. It doesn't cover the positive nature with which fear of God is treated in the Bible. It's never in the cowering and terrified sense. Consider this passage from Psalm 130, verses 3 to 6. If that's the band that you prefer, that's the band I want you thinking about. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, that you might be feared. I wait for the Lord, my soul waits, and in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning, more than watchmen for the morning. You can see in this passage the contrast between these two different types of fear. At the center verse, you have the transition, but with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared. Now this doesn't make sense if he's talking about the terror type of fear. Who would you rather offend? A big burly man who is unforgiving or one who is forgiving? You'd pick the forgiving one every time. The first one would beat you to a pulp, but the other would let you get away with it. Why would you be fearful? Why would you be terrified of a God who forgives? Verse 3, the first paragraph up there, has the kind of God that you should be terrified of. An angry God who keeps all record of your wrongs. No one could survive before him and his terrifying anger. Imagine at the end of the first Indiana Jones movies, where the villains are literally melting before the Ark of the Covenant. That's the kind of judgment that would be terrifying. But contrast that to the rest of the verses here. But with you there is forgiveness, that you might be feared. I wait for the Lord, my soul waits, and in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning, more than watchmen for the morning. This isn't a terror fear. It's a longing, a reverent, awe-filled fear and trust of the Lord. The psalmist sets his hope, his joy, his deepest desires for the Lord. And that's the kind of fear that we're dealing with. A joyful fear, a deep desire and longing for God. It's with God's forgiveness, with his love, that this joyful fear is possible. Let's look back at that 1 John passage again. Such love, there is no fearing love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment. God's love drives out the terror of God. And instead it fills us with this joyful fear of God and love back to God, even if it's ever so faint and imperfect in comparison to his love for us. It's this love that drives out fear and drives obedience. We don't obey God out of fear of hell and judgment. Christianity is not about following the law rules to be good enough for God, or for God or to be good enough just to pass judgment unscathed. If that's the depth of your Christianity, it's shallow and possibly not even Christian. Instead, the root of the Christian life, obedience and sacrifice, all come out of a response to God's love and love back to God. And when it's that love that drives you, your obedience follows from that. It's not only obedience, but also gives us what we need to overcome the terror kind of fear, which brings us to our third point, which is not on this paragraph. One of the consequences of fear of the Lord is that it diminishes fear of everything else. As I said at the start, the terror kind of fear comes with the risk of losing something or damaging something that is valued or loved. One of the key ways to overcome fear is to want or fear something more than whatever you're afraid of, or to have trust that what you fear will not come to pass. Now, I'm scared of needles. I get a bit wobbly, weak, and squirmy around them. Not really comfortable at all. I'm sure there are people who are far more scared than me. But despite my fear, I can go to the doctors and get a blood test taken or get a shot when I need to. Because both of trust in the doctor and the fear of the disease that they will be preventing. I can face my fear for those things, but face me with something else, like, say, acupuncture or a tattoo, and I will give you a very hard no. The payoff is not worth facing my fear. Similarly, fear of the Lord drives out other fears, both through trust, as Leighton was talking about last week, but also by being the greater love. We just went through 1 John on the love of God for us. And when we reflect on that, His power, His promises, we can face fear knowing that He has our back, so to speak. He is able to protect us in any situation, even the most desperate and dire. We look on His love and we see the promises to turn even the bad things to good at the end. So even when bad things come, we can have comfort and find security in Him. Lennon was talking last week about trust, about wholehearted trust in God before difficult or even nonsensical situations. Recognizing that even when we don't see the answers, we can see God's love and care for us on the cross. With that perspective, we can trust God. We no longer need to have deep fear because our deepest needs are secure. Fearing other things, danger, losing possessions, the direction of the future, disease, they're real fears, but they no longer come with deep existential terror because we can trust that in the end, He has our good in mind. Consequently, we don't need to go scrambling after other things for protections of these things. We don't need a strong man to protect us. We don't need money to be our security. Why would we go chasing those other things to be our security when we have the love of the Creator of all things? But on the other hand, if God is our greatest joy, our greatest fear, then threats to other things just pale in comparison. If He is our greatest treasure, we can stand the loss of those other things. Now, it's a bit of a cliche, but I'm sure you've seen movies that carry this storyline. You have the unstoppable protagonist chasing the villain, not scared of anything. But for the villain to bring the hero to their needs, all they need to do is capture the hero's family, friend, or other significant relation. And then suddenly the hero is brought to heel. It's a great way to bring tension into a movie without making the hero seem weak. But they have this one thing that the hero values more than stopping their plan for world domination. And the hero crumbles just to save what is more valuable to him. Lyndon shared this morning the story of Horatio Spafford. He lost so much. He lost all his children to a ship accident crossing the ocean. But because of his greater assurance, he was able to write on the same voyage that they took before and died on. He was able to write, "It is well with my soul." I'm sure he was devastated at the loss of his daughters, and rightfully so. But because of the Lord, his greatest love was still secure. is able to say it is well with my soul directly in the face of that loss. The greater the love or the greater fear will dominate when choices have to be made. And so when the Lord is your greatest joy, it leaves you able to face the loss of anything else. Now, I was inspired when thinking about this sermon from a couple of verses from Daniel 3. So for those of you who know your Bible stories, this is the story of the fiery furnace. But for those of you whose memory is a little fuzzy, I'll go through the context. To put in context, Nebuchadnezzar, he's the king of Babylon, the ruling empire at the time, established a giant golden statue. And then he issued a royal decree that when the music played, everyone was to bow down and worship the statue, or they will be thrown into a fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were 3 Jewish exiles. They'd been taken from Judah, their homeland, as youths, and then trained to serve as administrators in the king's palace. They refused to bow down to the statue, so their rivals brought the news of their referral to the king. They're brought before the king, who asked them, as in Daniel 3:14, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I'll give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of musical instruments. But if you refuse, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, "Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. The rest of the story then plays out. They throw the 3 men into the fire, which is now so hot that the men who throw them in die from the heat. But when Nebuchadnezzar looks in, he sees 4 men walking about in the fire, unharmed, including one who he says looks like a son of God. He then calls the 3 men out, and the 3 of them are untouched by the fire. They don't even smell of smoke. God has protected them the way that he said they would. But the part I want to focus on is the men's response to Nebuchadnezzar. They were faced with the very real threat of death from essentially the Vladimir Putin of their day. And there is no fear in their response. It's calm, it's measured, and you can see it's broken down into 2 parts. The first half is that God is willing and able to save them, which he does. They have no need to fear the king because of God's control. They trust God, his power, and his love, and because of that, they can look the most powerful man in the world in the eyes and say no. The second half of their response, though, comes after the but. But even if he doesn't, we will never bow down. Even if God does not come through, if his plan was for them to be martyred for their faith, like many have done before and since, even then, they would rather die than commit idolatry. They looked at where their priorities and their loves were. They consider the proper worship of God more valuable than their lives. And so their love of God drove out their fear. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, I pray that we might fear you more, that we might love you more. Lord, show us your love more deeply. Overwhelm our hearts with awe, that when we look at you, we might see your splendor and your perfect love. I pray this in your name. Amen.